The United States and Canada share the world's longest undefended border. For nearly 2 centuries, this relationship has represented one of the most stable partnerships in international relations. Recently, however, that stability has been tested in unprecedented ways. Understanding what's happening requires looking beyond political statements to examine the underlying economic realities that bind these two nations together. President Trump has made a striking claim. He stated that Canada depends entirely on the United States, while America has no corresponding reliance on its northern neighbor. He has repeated this assertion multiple times, even suggesting that Canada would benefit from becoming America's 51st state. These aren't offhand remarks. They represent a deliberate positioning that challenges decades of accepted understanding about North American economic integration. The question we need to examine is whether this characterization matches the actual data. What does the economic relationship between these countries really look like when we move past rhetoric and focus on measurable facts? Consider the energy sector first. This is where claims of independence face their most significant test. Each day, approximately 4.1 million barrels of Canadian crude oil enter the United States. This isn't a minor contribution to American energy needs. Canada supplied roughly 63% of all crude oil imports to the United States in 2024. No other country comes close to this volume. The nature of this oil matters considerably. Canadian crude from Alberta's oil sands is heavy crude, dense and sulfur-rich. American refineries, particularly the large facilities along the Gulf Coast, were specifically designed and built to process this exact type of oil. These aren't facilities that can easily switch to different crude sources. The infrastructure investments required to handle heavy crude took decades and billions of dollars to put in place. When someone suggests America could simply replace this volume overnight, they're overlooking fundamental infrastructure realities. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed from previous levels. Mexico's output continues to decline year after year. Middle Eastern sources could theoretically fill some gaps, but this would require rebuilding supply chains, reconfiguring refinery operations, and accepting dependence on a region where political stability often measures in months rather than generations. Natural gas presents an even starker picture. Canada supplies 98% of natural gas imported by the United States. When homes across the Midwest heat themselves during winter months, when power plants in northeastern states generate electricity to maintain the grid, that energy overwhelmingly flows through pipelines originating in Canada. These pipeline networks represent infrastructure built over many decades. They cannot be replicated through policy decisions or executive actions. Electricity follows a similar pattern. 82% of all electricity imported by the United States comes from Canada. States including New York, Michigan, and Minnesota don't purchase this power as a supplement to domestic production. They depend on it to meet peak demand, maintain grid stability, and prevent blackouts when consumption spikes during extreme weather. The total value of the energy relationship between these countries reached $151 billion in 2024. This figure doesn't represent exploitation by one nation of another. It reflects choices made by American businesses, utilities, and consumers based on reliability, proximity, and infrastructure compatibility. Beyond energy, the broader trade relationship reveals similar patterns of deep integration. Canada ranked as the top destination for American goods exports in 2024. American businesses exported $350 billion worth of goods to Canada. Meanwhile, imports from Canada totaled $413 billion, creating a goods trade deficit of approximately $62 billion. Trade deficits often generate political controversy, but the analysis requires more nuance than simply comparing two numbers. When services are included alongside goods, the United States actually runs a surplus with Canada. The overall deficit shrinks to somewhere between $35 and $45 billion, depending on calculation methods. Even this revised figure can be misleading because it treats trade as a competition where one side wins and the other loses. Modern North American trade operates quite differently. Roughly half of all trade between the United States and Canada doesn't involve finished products crossing the border once. Instead, components, raw materials, and intermediate goods cross multiple times as part of integrated manufacturing processes. The automotive industry illustrates this integration clearly. When a truck is assembled in Michigan, components in that vehicle have often crossed the border several times during production. Steel might originate in Ontario, get shipped to Ohio for forming into specific parts, return to Canada for additional processing, then come back to the United States for final assembly. This pattern repeats across numerous industries. In 2023, Canadian exports to the United States represented 21% of everything Canada sold globally. Meanwhile, 76% of all Canadian merchandise exports went to the American market. Canada cannot quickly diversify away from this concentration. The necessary infrastructure doesn't exist, the business relationships aren't established, and geography makes alternatives extremely difficult. However, this dependence operates in both directions. American businesses, workers, and consumers rely equally on this trade flowing smoothly. When tariffs of 25% are imposed on the largest trading partner, the effects don't remain isolated on one side of the border. Supply chains face disruption, business costs increase, and consumers ultimately pay higher prices. These consequences are now visible in real economic data. The tariffs imposed in early 2025 affected Canada immediately. By April, Canadian exports to the United States had declined 26% from their January levels. Manufacturing output contracted. Export-dependent provinces like Ontario and Alberta experienced business layoffs, canceled expansion plans, and desperate searches for alternative markets that don't exist at necessary scales. The American economy didn't escape these effects. Overall, United States imports fell 20% in April 2025, representing the largest single-month decline since the 2009 financial crisis, excluding the pandemic period. Businesses cannot instantly locate domestic replacements when tariffs are imposed on half of all imports. Supply chains don't reconfigure within weeks. Production capacity doesn't materialize because of policy pronouncements. American manufacturers suddenly paying 25% more for Canadian steel didn't celebrate this development. They absorbed costs, reduced profit margins, and began planning workforce reductions. American consumers haven't yet felt the full impact, but inflation, which had been moderating, has begun ticking upward again. Federal Reserve officials are monitoring the situation carefully. Economists across different political perspectives are describing the situation using terms like self-inflicted wound and unforced error. The diplomatic consequences extend beyond economics. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian Prime Minister publicly stated that Canadians now face dark days brought on by a country they can no longer trust, identifying that country as the United States. This represents a fundamental rupture in a relationship that has underpinned North American security and prosperity for generations. The annexation rhetoric hasn't remained theoretical discussion. President Trump has openly and repeatedly suggested that Canada should become the 51st state. He has proposed using economic pressure to achieve this outcome. He has questioned Canadian sovereignty and treated the entire country as potential acquisition rather than sovereign nation. Canadian public opinion has responded decisively. Polling conducted in 2025 showed 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. In a country where consensus on any issue is rare, this represents near universal agreement. Another poll found 82% of Canadians would prefer rejoining the British Commonwealth rather than becoming part of the United States. Canadian nationalism has surged in response. Buy Canadian campaigns have expanded significantly. Consumers are actively avoiding American products. Businesses are exploring ways to reduce dependence on United States markets. Canadian automobile trips to the United States have declined 31% year over year. This isn't driven by gas prices or currency exchange rates. Canadians are choosing not to spend money in a country whose leadership treats them with open contempt. Canada has responded with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, with another $125 billion targeted if escalation continues. Canadian provinces have even discussed cutting energy exports to specific American states. Ontario floated the possibility of stopping electricity to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. While they stepped back from this position, the mere discussion indicates how severely the relationship has deteriorated. International observers are drawing concerning parallels. Trump's statements about Canada are being compared to Putin's rhetoric about Ukraine before the invasion, or Xi Jinping's language regarding Taiwan. The suggestion that a neighboring country isn't truly independent, that its sovereignty is conditional, that absorption is inevitable and even beneficial. These comparisons are coming from serious foreign policy analysts, not partisan commentators. NATO allies are watching with growing concern. If the United States is willing to economically pressure Canada, its longest-standing ally, what does this signal about American commitments to smaller nations that depend on security guarantees? The entire rules-based international order that America spent 70 years building rests on the principle that treaties matter, that alliances transcend mere transactions, that sovereignty is inviolable regardless of relative power. When a president suggests using economic force to acquire Greenland, floats military options for the Panama Canal, and proposes annexing Canada, he isn't simply making controversial statements. He is systematically undermining the perception that the United States can be trusted to uphold the norms it claims to champion. Once that perception erodes, it doesn't recover quickly, regardless of future leadership changes. Let's test the central claim seriously. Suppose Canada stopped exporting energy to the United States tomorrow. This isn't politically likely, but as an analytical exercise, it reveals the practical implications. Refineries along the Gulf Coast would need to locate 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude from alternative sources. Venezuelan production remains at historic lows. Mexican output continues declining. Middle Eastern suppliers would require months or years to reconfigure shipping routes and refinery processes. Meanwhile, gasoline prices would spike, heating costs would surge, and political consequences would be immediate and severe. If Canada halted natural gas exports, homes across the Midwest would face severe heating challenges during winter. Power plants in the Northeast would scramble for alternative fuel sources. Rolling blackouts would become not merely possible, but probable. Economic damage would be measured not in billions, but potentially trillions as manufacturing slows, businesses close, and entire regions struggle to maintain basic functions. These aren't hypothetical doomsday scenarios invented for dramatic effect. These are the practical realities of what not needing Canada actually means when the logic is followed to its conclusion. The United States economy has been built over decades on the assumption of Canadian reliability. Oil flows northward to southward. Natural gas moves through pipelines without disruption. Electricity crosses the border to maintain grid stability. Steel, aluminum, lumber, and countless other goods move freely as part of integrated supply chains. The claim of non-reliance isn't simply incorrect. It's so fundamentally disconnected from economic reality that it raises questions about whether basic understanding of modern economies is guiding policy decisions.